Hi, this is Dan Foster, National Review Online, and I'm here with Jacob. Jacob, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Jacob Haqq-Misra. I'm currently at Penn State. I'm a postdoctoral scholar. I did my PhD in meteorology and astrobiology.
Cool. Now, Jacob, the reason that we're here talking today is because you and two colleagues, one from Penn State, and I forget where the other one had a NASA affiliation.
He's doing some work at NASA now, but he actually got his PhD at Penn State as well, and that's how
Okay,
we know
so
him.
so three Penn State guys. You wrote a kind of what you call a scenario analysis, I think, of different things, different ways that first contact with an extraterrestrial intelligence might play out. And then myself and some others poked fun at the paper a little bit. And so, but that being said, there's a lot of interesting, compelling topics that you guys covered, and lots of fodder for debate and discussion. So why don't we start with you kind of laying out the genesis of the paper and what you argue?
Sure, absolutely. So Sean and myself and Seth, who are the three authors on the paper, these are some topics that we think about a lot, and it has a lot to do with the future of human civilization and then certainly extraterrestrials. But in some sense, our thinking about extraterrestrials is a way of sort of projecting future trajectories for human civilization and seeing where we may end up. So just as a preface there, that's really the fundamental value I see in this, not so much as what are the aliens going to do as how does this help us learn about our civilization. But that being said, I'm certainly interested in aliens, and I hope we find some soon. Part of what prompted this paper was comments from Stephen Hawking maybe a year or so ago, and I think it was on the Discovery Channel or on a documentary, where Stephen Hawking expressed concern over attempts to communicate with potential extraterrestrials because he thought they would probably pose a threat.
Right.
Now, that's quite possible. I'm not going to say that's impossible, but I think it's not the only case. And we noticed that there was an awful lot of press and reaction to Hawking's comment. He's Stephen Hawking. But we thought, like, okay, there's actually a lot of possible ways that contact with extraterrestrials could occur. And so far as we could do in our research, there was very limited analyses of looking at a broad range of outcomes. It was mostly individual authors giving their particular opinions. So that's really the motivation for us, was just to say, well, there's ways they could help us, there's ways they could harm us, there's ways that they could neither help or harm us, have neutral outcomes, or, it could be accidental, it could be on purpose. So that was really our motivation.
Now, it's true that you look at a range of outcomes, and you don't, in the paper, you don't necessarily weight them in terms of likelihood or probability, whether subjective or based on some model, either way. But I wondered if you had particular feelings about that, because it seems to me that Hawking is right, and maybe that's just my cautious nature, but it seems to me that Hawking is right, that there are way more scenarios that one can imagine in which contact goes badly for one or both the human race and the extraterrestrials, because there are both kind of malicious, malevolent intentions that could be behind the approach of aliens to Earth, and there are also, as you point out in the paper, a variety of circumstances in which unintentional harm comes to us, whether it's because there are alien germs that our bodies can't fight off, or a variety of other things. But I mean, did you and your colleagues sort of come to a conclusion one way or another about whether or not it was more likely that first contact would be bad?
Yes and no, a little bit. The no is that no, we did not decide to estimate probabilities for these, because that's really pretty impossible. What's the likelihood that an outcome will be one way or another? But what we did do, and part of our motivation for writing some of our analysis in this paper was, we've thought about what's known as the Fermi paradox. This is, where are the aliens?
Right.
And the short version is the galaxy is very old. There's lots of time for life to have arisen. There's many stars that have potentially habitable planets, at least we think. So if life is common and intelligence is common, any technological society slightly more advanced than us could rapidly colonize the galaxy. So the question is, why don't we see them? And there's many answers to this. I won't get into them all, but one of them that we've looked at, and we wrote a paper on this a few years ago, we call the sustainability solution. And it's not an entirely new idea. We put a new spin on it. But the short version is exponential growth or other really fast growth might not be sustainable in the long term. And so this hypothetical civilization that rapidly colonizes the galaxy may actually be able to do so, but they might reach a threshold then where they can't expand any further because of technological or physical limits, and then they collapse. It's like an Easter Island type scenario or other instances of collapse on Earth. So given that, it seems almost a requirement that any civilization that sticks around long enough to still last on astronomical timescales pretty much has to have solved these sustainable development problems. So that means we call these slower growth civilizations. They don't have to necessarily have zero growth, but they have to grow as their carrying capacity grows. They grow as their resource base expands, not faster than that. And so the corollary then, of course, this is not a conclusion. This is not the logical conclusion, but perhaps slower growing civilizations tend to be a little more protective of ecosystems. At least they must have realized that taking care of ecosystems is important for long-term survival. So maybe they've got some sort of ethical system that's a little more protective of ecosystems. Their slower growth may give them less expansionistic tendencies, which may make them less aggressive to some other society they contact. So I'm not going to speak for my co-authors, and I'm not going to say that we would put any likelihood on one scenario or another, but perhaps those societies that manage to last long time scales maybe are less aggressive and less expansionistic, and that might have something to do with more beneficial to neutral contact versus harmful.
Okay, I have a lot of questions about this, and so I'll break them up. One I'll just say as a layman, when I read about the Fermi paradox, my solution, and it might be quick and dirty, but my answer was, well, and correct me if I'm wrong. Well, we know the mass of the universe, the rough mass of the universe, at least at the time of the Big Bang, right? And we also think that the universe is infinite. So why isn't it just the case that there's a little bit of stuff and a whole lot of space, and there, and so especially the size of the universe being infinite, why shouldn't we just conclude that the materials for life are spread out over vast, inconceivable distances, and so it could very possibly be the case that the infinite universe is teeming with life, and that it's
Sure,
very unlikely that we'll ever come across it. Especially if you buy that, right? The latest theorizing on the fate of the universe, as it were, is not only that everything's moving apart from everything else, but that it might be accelerating apart from everything else, such that there will come a time, and I think this idea is fascinating, maybe millions of years from now, when the ancient Greeks and geocentrism will be proven right, if only because we won't be able to see any stars at all if everything's accelerating away from everything else. The sky will be pitch black. I don't know if you've read anything about that or know anything about that or have any opinions, but I find that a fascinating solution. Sure. Yeah. But anyway, so what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I mean, fundamentally, I think you're right. I mean, there's a lot of answers to this Fermi paradox. So yeah, it's completely possible that life is rare, and there's different degrees of rarity. So the galaxy has billions upon billions of stars, but there are more galaxies in the universe than there are people. There are billions upon billions of galaxies. So the question is, life could arise once per galaxy, and that would still be billions upon billions of instances of life in the universe, but most of whom can never talk to each other because they're separated. They're in different galaxies, and galaxies are separated by vast, vast amounts of space. As an example, any science fiction that we really read, Star Trek and Star Wars being common ones, they all take place in our own galaxy. So right. Even these popular science fiction.
Well, a minor nerd correction: Star Wars actually takes place a long time ago in a galaxy far, far
I'm sorry.
away.
Yes, you're right. You're right. So it's in a galaxy far away, but it's in a single galaxy. So That was my point. Yeah. So not ours, but they don't span multiple galaxies. Right. So there's plenty of room for science fiction and all sorts of exploration within one galaxy. So that's one of your points. Yes, life. We don't know how life arises. We know it happened at least once on Earth, and that's about all we know. So yes, maybe life is really hard to form, or maybe intelligence is really hard to form. Maybe
Right.
there's plenty of inhabited planets, but intelligence only happens once per galaxy.
Right. Well, that's another thing I want to talk about. But one more question on your solution to the paradox is that this seems to be the source. You and your colleagues place a lot of weight throughout the paper on the idea of what you call sustainable growth, and that's a familiar concept to anybody who studies developmental economics or is interested in politics more broadly. And so, I think a source of a lot of criticism of your paper, including from me, comes from the sense in which you kind of anthropomorphize the problem, this sort of this universal problem, where are the aliens, and apply a model that isn't necessarily even widely accepted when we're talking about developmental economics, and you ask it to do a lot of work, and similar sort of corollaries to sustainable growth pop up throughout the paper in your explanations of of why things might go down in a particular way, which we can get into more of the specifics later. But my question in reading about it, and I thought I understood it, and you sort of confirmed it in your explanation of it, but it just seems to me like what you're calling sustainable growth is just kind of how evolution happens, how evolution happens anyway. Is it not the case that sort of populations expand as quickly and only as quickly as their resources allow them to? I mean, in a given niche, or they adapt so that they can fill a different niche. But isn't this? I'm kind of confused about what additional work sustainable development is doing here. I mean, isn't that just how populations grow or fail?
Oh, I see what you're saying. I guess it's a little bit different because there's population growth of just any sort of biological population, and then there's developmental growth of a civilization, which on Earth we really only have the example of human civilization. So far we don't have dolphin civilization yet, although that'd be great.
There's a great Onion headline. Dolphins develop opposable thumbs. Oh crap, says humanity.
I know exactly what you're talking about. I love that. Yeah.
The abacus starts rolling up on the in the sandy beaches, and then 1,000. Anyway, sorry. So go ahead.
So some the problems of development that relate to sustainability, to me, are problems inherent to civilizational growth and not necessarily just to biological population.
But isn't it all about resources? I mean, are you really want to make the argument, especially considering some of the other things that you say in the paper about how there's and you seem to at least informally endorse this, or intrinsic implicitly, I should say, endorse this, that ecosystems as such are valuable, and there's nothing especially valuable about human civilization versus other kinds of civilization. So, it doesn't preclude you from making the argument that I think you're making now, but do you really want to say that there's something particularly special about civilizational development? Isn't it just all about resources at the end of the day, whether you're a cockroach or a country?
Well, so yes, actually, fundamentally, you're right. But the question is sort of the rates of growth, and so we'll take a non-civilizational example, just some population of gazelle or something in a field. They're going to reach an equilibrium. The population of gazelle may grow and until let's say it's a predator-prey model. So they grow until they're kept in balance with the lions that eat them, and then the population stays in check. But during that growth phase, suppose that you place some gazelle in a really big field, and they have 100 years of constant growth before their growth level is kept in check by the predators. So during that, the question is, how long can they grow? And I think that in some certainly not all, or even most, I don't want to say that, but there are some claims for human society that growth may be unbounded. And that's really the criticism that we're challenging. It's not to say that growth is always limited by space and resources, but we have to keep in mind that there are limits. It's hard to say what is our carrying capacity now, but some people would say that we're maybe above carrying capacity with, close to, 7 billion people on the planet.
So charitably, I take your meaning. I think simply put, you're interested in the sustainable growth hypothesis is about consciousness and cognition and intelligence doing the work that natural selection and resource scarcity does in non-human populations, right? You're hoping to kind of head off resource scarcity at the pass by sort of planning ahead.
That's exactly right. I mean, and that's part of the difference between a human and some other creatures that have less cognitive and technological abilities. Certainly, the decision to say go to the moon is probably going to be a cognitive decision versus a just coming about by natural selection.
Right.
I mean, it's hard to talk about these things. It's a spectrum, but yes, it's fundamentally I would agree with you.
Okay, so this brings me to my next broad topic, which is that you sort of, when I was reading your, introduction, my initial hunch was to just sort of challenge the whole premise, and I'll tell you what I mean. I brought to mind one of my favorite quotations from one of my favorite philosophers, Wittgenstein, when he said, "If a lion could talk, we couldn't understand him." Right, and that was exactly my thought when reading your paper, which is that why should we start from the assumption that an extraterrestrial intelligence would be recognizable to us as such, would recognize us as intelligent, and would have any truck with any of our concepts or categories? I mean, why start from the assumption, as you seem to do, and as most of the science fiction that your paper draws on, at least for thought experiment inspiration, seems to do, which is that aliens are just a little bit different from us. I mean, why should we start from that point of view?
Well, no, I mean, I do agree with you, and I think in our paper we actually do make a lot of these caveats. I mean, we have a section where we say, of course, not even water-based or carbon-based life is necessarily the most likely, although this is our example, this is the example of life on Earth, but, we cite scientists who look at silicon-based life and alcohol solvents. We mentioned the possibility of energy-based life forms or life that travels between dimensions, or even just the simple analogy that we may be like ants to any extraterrestrial.
Right,
observer.
I do remember that.
Maybe they're everywhere. Maybe they're all over, and we just have no way of seeing them because we lack the context to recognize them. So yeah, I agree that all these possibilities are completely open. But we sort of take the approach of stating that this is an open question and we really can't say anything about extraterrestrials until we find them. Given that, if we want to say anything more, then we have to add caveats and sort of make the parallels to maybe the growth of human civilization without calling them humans. I understand what you're saying, and of course the way we portray this is not the only way extraterrestrials could be. But really what we're doing is we're saying there's a set of things that we know are possible based on human experience. We know that technological exploration of space is possible. And based on that, we can extrapolate that it seems quite possible that travel between stars using spacecraft should be plausible given technology we know exists. So that's really what we're doing. There are probably unknown technologies out there that humans haven't figured out yet and may not ever do, but we can't invoke those because we have no idea what their capabilities are. So it's really an exercise in taking what we know is possible based on our experiences and extrapolating it a little bit and seeing where those conclusions might lead us.
Okay, I'll buy that. Let's get to the red meat here. I think, and talk about the politics of the paper, because the source of a lot of the criticism, including again my own, comes from this. So you started with this sustainable development hypothesis as an answer initially to the question of where all the aliens are. But like I said, you see it sort of come up again and again throughout the paper, and just a couple of examples that sprung to mind when I was thinking about our conversation today. When you say perhaps the reason why we haven't been contacted is because the extraterrestrials are waiting for a marker of sufficient social advancement, like sustainable development or international unity. And there are other examples as well. But the general point I want to make, so when I read that, I thought to myself, well, why on Earth or in the galaxy would there be any inherent value in international unity from the point of view of an extraterrestrial race? And why, would sustainable development necessarily be of any import to aliens? So the general point I want to make is that it seems like the worldview that backs the paper is one that says, sort of by any definition, the kinds of extraterrestrial races that we're likely to come into contact with, for good or for ill, and especially the ones that would be beneficial to us, are going to, by the very fact of that they've reached an advanced state that allows them to travel here, are going to resemble, as it happens, a kind of, and I don't use this word disparagingly necessarily, but a kind of utopia that we would recognize from American progressive liberals' dreams. So, do you think that that's a fair characterization? What are the politics of the paper? Where are you all coming from ethically, philosophically, politically, and sort of how do you, at the risk of blabbing on and on, the other thing I thought about, because there's obviously a lot of science fiction in the paper, and that's, like I said, that's kind of one of the only intuition pumps or sources of thought experiments that we have when we're talking about extraterrestrials, right? Because there isn't much good science on it.
Right.
But sort of utopianism, and progressive utopianism in particular, is as old as science fiction is. H.G. Wells, right? Was a huge political progressive. He coined the term. Here's a plug for my colleague's book. He coined the term in a speech, liberal fascism, when he was calling for England to adopt a safer, saner form of European fascism as its own politics, right? But there's always been this idea that through technology and through science, we can solve all the intractable problems that have plagued society since the beginning of time, and that we're heading for some end state where the scarcity problem has been solved, where conflict between men has been resolved. Or at least that if it's not an end state, then we can ever improve, right? That even if we don't come to, even if man is not perfectible, he's betterable, for lack of a better word. So there's always been this thread in science fiction. We recognize, Star Trek: The Next Generation, I think, is the paradigmatic case. But there's also always been a thread in science fiction of dystopian futures. And a healthy skepticism of what it means that as technology improves, so does the technology of control, and the technology of coercion, and the technology of destruction, and human nature being what it is. This doesn't necessarily bode well for our future. So, to lasso all this up and get it back to a question for discussion, where are you coming from that you purposely chose the kind of worldview associated with that utopian, optimistic, progressive science fiction, and in turn, what does that say about the politics of this paper?
Sure. Well, I guess to start off answering that, I would say that we do have this thread of extraterrestrials that live long enough to see astronomical timescales pass. By definition, must have solved these long-term sustainability issues.
Right.
So we sort of start from that as sort of one side of the ethical analysis. But now in the paper, we do also talk about other ethical frameworks. We talk about selfish extraterrestrials who may have, a variety of their own motives as the most important outcome. So I'm not sure that. I mean, you are correct that the sustainability thread does run through the paper. I don't think it's the only ethical thread. We maybe emphasize it though because it's probably the most unique compared to what else has been brought up in the literature. Like the idea of selfish extraterrestrials that wants to come to Earth either to eat us or to enslave us or to use our resources or to take over our planet. I mean, this idea is quite widespread.
Or to use us for entertainment, which is...
Yeah, it's very popular in movies and all that. So we do mention it.
Princess Leia in the gold bikini.
Yes, yeah. So that's there in the paper as well. So I don't think me or my co-authors would say that the benevolent, utopian, sustainable extraterrestrials are the only possibility. Certainly there's this possibility of the selfish extraterrestrials as well, or any other type of valuation on the part of the extraterrestrials. The other point that we do make briefly in like our second section on the background of the paper is the fact that extraterrestrials may not be homogeneous. They may not have one world or colony government, and they may have factions. I mean, we hardly have a global government on this planet. We have hundreds of nations that don't get along much of the time. So the likelihood of extraterrestrial homogeneity is uncertain, and it's quite possible that maybe there's a large faction of sustainable extraterrestrials that come visit, and they're shortly thereafter followed by the warlike aggressors. I mean, so that's a caveat we sort of throw at the beginning of the paper, but then we carry on the analysis sort of as if they're acting as one, and that's really just for the simplicity of our analysis, because otherwise it's too complicated and it's too much just science fiction. But clearly that's a very real possibility that the aliens will not all act as one. But so given all those caveats, you're asking sort of where's the politics and where do we come from? I mean, me personally, I study climate. I study climate sort of in astrobiological context, the climate of early Earth and early Mars, how climate feeds back with life and habitability. I do a little bit with modern climate change now. Seth does some with climate change. Sean is a little bit more on the astrobiological side of things. I'm not going to say that any of us have our own political agenda. We're all scientists in the science community. I think we are aware that sustainable development issues are important today and worth thinking about and worth attending to and researching and putting into practice. And so it's really seeing some of that develop in the world, some of these tendencies and these ideas that sort of spawned us to think, well, how does sustainability apply on a larger scale than Earth? So maybe more than even trying to advocate for any sort of agenda, it's really extending some of these ideas of resource limitations and how to deal with that to a broader scale.
But let me push you on that for a second, because there's been kind of a mini, actually, boom of prominent liberals, leftist center figures in this country, and I'm thinking specifically of Paul Krugman a week or two ago, and he used it, and I'm not saying he invested a lot in it, but he used it in kind of a casual way, using the threat of alien invasion as an example of the sort of thing, in Krugman's case, that would help us get our act together and do the kinds of massively organized global public spending that he thinks that we have to do to get out of the recession. Now, the reason I bring up the... Sorry, go ahead.
I did see that. This was where he almost said we need a fake alien invasion to...
Right.
Yeah.
Now, the reason I bring this up is because, I mean, I think that there's a thread, and it's probably fair to say it's on both sides of American politics, but there's certainly been a prominent thread dating back to a paper called The Moral Equivalent of War by, I think if it's not Dewey, it's slipping, one of the early American pragmatists, it's William James. in 1901 or 1899 or something like that, where James argues that, okay, to enact the progressive agenda to get society where we need it to be, we need to inspire the kind of both dedication to country and enthusiasm about work, and about progress that comes from times of war. But since all good progressives are pacifists, or at least support very, very narrow conception of what a just war is, we can't actually go to war. So James is here arguing for creating what he calls the moral equivalent of war, which is, I think, a delicious term because it's ambiguously read. Some people, he's putting emphasis on the moral equivalent of war as opposed to the immoral war, which is itself immoral. But people, when you hear the phrase used today, it's well, you've done something so terrible that it is the moral equivalent of war, if that makes sense.
Sure.
But anyway, so starting with James, and then we see that the first great kind of exertion of progressivism spans from Teddy Roosevelt through Woodrow Wilson, the former being really militaristic and nationalistic, and the latter actually involving us in the First World War. But both were very, very much aware of the power of war, or the threat of it, to marshal the kinds of social action on a large scale that's required for the realization of progressive hopes and dreams. And it continues to this day, the war on poverty, there's a reason this martial language is what it is, and this is not, by no means am I the first person or the 100th person to make this point. But to again, finally get to a question here, thinking about Krugman, thinking about that thread, tell me why it's not fair to read your paper as a kind of call to arms, saying, I mean, especially because we'll get to, I think, the thing that prompted the original notice of your paper in the mainstream media, the idea that we could be destroyed preemptively by an alien race that was interested in sustainable development because of climate change, of anthropogenic climate change. So tell me why I shouldn't be justified in thinking that this is a bit of scaremongering going on, that just like Krugman, you're saying we'd better get our asses in line on global warming and sustainability, or the aliens will come and get us.
Well, so on the most practical level, even if there are extraterrestrials out there, they're way too far away to have any immediate effect on us now. And, of course, I'm now ruling out the direct presence of extraterrestrials in the solar system and UFOs and all that. So I'm not saying that that's there. So if any extraterrestrial that's out there is going to be, anywhere from 100 to 1,000 plus light years away, a light year being the distance it takes light to travel in a year. So that means if we do something now that's observable, it's going to take, 1,000 years for those extraterrestrials to observe it, and then 1,000 years for them to respond if they're going to travel here or something. So the threat today of any sort of action is actually quite small,
right?
Just because of those astronomical distances involved. However, that's just the really practical sort of end of it. On the other side of it, our paper is not intended to really point out that there are. It is intended to point out that there are various ways that contact could proceed, but it's certainly not intended to be a scare tactic. It's not intended to, develop an arms race for protecting against extraterrestrial invasion. And as I said before, really the scenario analysis is an exercise in future trajectories of human civilization through the lens of, in this case, an extraterrestrial. So really the scenario analysis, in my mind, has the most value looking at, here are some possible trajectories we could end up on. Which of these do we like, and how do we make those happen, and how do we avoid the bad trajectories? So even though the paper is about aliens, I think really it's about human civilization. And that's a lot of the reason.
That's sort of what I'm saying. That's sort of what I'm saying. You're using the again, I don't think it's malevolent. It might not even be conscious, but you're using the kind of specter of an alien attack. Not, and you, as you said, it's not going to happen. So, or anytime soon. So, but you're using it to kind of tell a story about what we have to do to get ourselves in line. So you said that earlier, and you just said it again. So that part at least is right. That you're almost sort of using it as an allegory or a frame for telling a story.
Right. If someone was way, a distance away and looking at us, what would they notice? And this whole idea that the one that got the most media coverage, this idea that
let's talk about that.
Okay, so this is the idea that the way the headlines ran was that aliens may come and kill us because of global warming, something like that.
Right.
The reason that we even came up with this scenario has actually more to do with astrobiology and the discovery of other planets. Really, we are doing astronomy now where we look at the light that's being emitted from other planets, and then you can see what kind of, that's exactly right, spectral signatures. You can see what kind of gases are in these atmospheres. We can do this with big planets, and we're getting better and better at doing it with close to Earth-sized planets, and eventually we will be able to do it with Earth-sized planets. So we know this is possible, and we've even done experiments where we've looked at the light that's emitted from Earth through various ways. So we know the signature that Earth puts out. So in constructing this scenario, we just said, well, what would you notice if you looked at the spectral signature of Earth? Well, oxygen, ozone, methane, carbon dioxide, water vapor. Well, what if you kept looking at it? If you kept looking at it and we kept emitting CO2, then you are actually going to see a change in atmospheric composition. And so that's really where this idea came from, is that any sort of change that we make on our atmospheric composition is actually remotely detectable, at least in theory, if you're an external observer and you have a big enough telescope.
Right, but again, this brings me back to the point of, and if you have the right concepts, and if you have the right understanding of what it takes to constitute life, right? So,
yes, of course. And so I completely agree with you, and there's all those caveats that exist, but the reason that we go down this path is because this is technology that we know is possible. So it's not to say this must happen, but we know that this is one possibility that can exist in the universe given physical constraints. And so since this is a possibility, then it is also perhaps possible for any other society out there. Not necessarily that it must occur that way, but it's at least a possible, plausible technology.
Okay, and I want to get to a little bit about the kind of ethics and politics on the Xeno side for a preemptive, strike against humanity, because I think that's fascinating. But just a technical question here that I think connects with what climate skeptics grasp onto when they make arguments against assuming that climate change is predominantly or entirely man-made, is that the spectral signature of Earth will have been radically different over the course of its has been radically different over the course of its history, and will be observed to be radically different by anyone who can see it, however many thousands of light years away. Right? I mean, there was a billion years when oxygen wasn't present in abundance.
Oh, sure.
And and there was the snowball Earth phase, and I remember my college geology rocks for jocks a little bit. I mean, and certainly when plant life became abundant, the signature of the atmosphere will have changed. So again, I just wonder.
It's the rate of change that's really the key here. The CO, carbon dioxide has changed tremendously over Earth's history. In the early Earth, carbon dioxide may have actually been, quite high, and this is before there was any oxygen. But the rate of change of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere today is unprecedented. That's different from the geologic history of Earth. And that rate of change, at least in theory with the big enough telescope, could be observed to be different than the sort of mundane geological changes that occur in a planet's atmospheric composition.
And is there anything that you could tell just by looking at the spectral signature of a planet from the point of view even of a society, of an alien society that had roughly the same cognitive architecture that we do. Is there anything you can tell from just the spectral signature that would let you know whether this was a positive or a negative development for any life that might be on that planet? In other words, if we all breathed carbon dioxide like trees, this could be seen as a boon.
Probably not. I can't think of anything obvious. It's if you make the multiple observations to notice the change in composition, maybe you could infer something about that. But strictly speaking, if there's a lot of astronomers and astrobiologists who are just interested in what spectral signature indicates life,
right.
And does oxygen and ozone and methane indicate life? That seems to be the best combination I've seen out, but there are no agreements for this. And if we could solve that problem, there'd be a lot of really excited people.
Right. Okay. So then before moving on, let's finally zero in on it. The idea, because I have the quote here, the pull quote here in front of me. If ETI doubt extraterrestrial intelligence, I think that stands for. Yeah. If ETI doubt that our course can be changed, then they may seek to preemptively destroy our civilization in order to protect other civilizations from us. A preemptive strike would be particularly likely in the early phases of our expansion, because a civilization may become increasingly difficult to destroy as it continues to expand. Humanity may just now be entering the period in which its rapid civilizational expansion could be detected by an ETI because our expansion has changed the composition of Earth's atmosphere. This is what we talked about. While it's difficult to estimate the likelihood of this scenario, it should, at minimum, give us pause as we evaluate our expansive tendencies. See, now it's the end of that I question, and given the line of questioning I've just asked you, I mean, it's that conclusion that this possibility should give us pause as we evaluate our expansive tendencies. But talk to me about. I mean, you're an astrobiologist, not a astropsychologist or a xenopsychologist, but give me some insight into you and your colleagues' thinking on why this sort of thing would be ponderable. What sort of civilization? What could we say about an alien civilization that decided to blow up a planet? Because, as you suggest in the paper, their ethics value ecosystems and not particular civilizations. The diversity of ecosystems. Right.
So this gets back to this idea of the sustainability solution, which we talked about a little bit. So if a unsustainable, expansionistic, exponentially growing society can rapidly colonize the galaxy, but then collapse because it doesn't last long enough, then the slower growth ones are the ones that stay around. That's sort of the sustainability solution. If you're the slower growth civilization, you realize the destructive possibilities of exponential growth. Because at any point you could get one of these civilizations that decides to exponentially, colonize the galaxy, take advantage of the resources. In doing that, you're probably going to end up, running into other civilizations if they're out there, probably have some sort of conflict, maybe end up destroying them. So if your goal is to maximize, I won't go there yet. So just we can get there in a little bit. But so if you realize that exponential expansion is destructive not only to the civilization doing that expansion, but also to other bystanders that may get in the way, then some slow growth extraterrestrial society may decide that it's important to keep other civilizations from getting out of hand and embarking on some sort of destructive exponential growth pattern.
Okay. I mean, but that presumes a lot about the sorts of things that motivate civilizations to do the things that they do. And again, I mean, not only does it presume a kind of unidirectional history that's headed towards some sort of end state, in this case an end state where a civilization has figured out a way to grow at a rate that will allow themselves to sustain themselves indefinitely, at least on a given time scale. Not only does it assume a lot about that, but it also assumes that that a civilization that how do I want to put this? It just seems to me that you see this kind of concern about growth and about expansion come up inevitably throughout history, and this kind of chastisement, self-chastisement, civilizational, I won't say self-hate because that's too strong of a word, but civilizational, reflexive kind of skepticism of one civilization's ambitions and methods. You see that in I would argue in decadent civilizations, in civilizations that have already kind of peaked and are on the decline. So it just seems to me that and I have no proof for this, this is just idle speculation, but it seems to me that it's likely that any race that is taken to the cosmos in sufficient force to be a threat to us is actually probably not at that phase. It's much more likely that we would take to the skies not out of some kind of Star Trek: The Next Generation universal curiosity, although I do think that that's a feature of at least the human psyche, but I think it's instrumental, and this gets back to our discussion of what's a cognitive decision versus what was selected for and is adaptationally advantage. I do think it's that universal curiosity, that wanderlust, whatever you want to call it, this romantic idea that we want to explore, or even the scientific idea, ideal that we are exploring just to acquire new knowledge. I think all of those are instrumental to survival and expansion, right, and thriving. I mean, I do kind of think it. I'm enough of a social Darwinist. I'm not a social Darwinist, but I'm enough of a social Darwinist to think that I can't imagine a scenario in which those things aren't playing a really, really big role in decisions about, packing a bunch of life forms onto a ship and rocketing thousands of light years away from somebody's home. I mean, I have to think that it's much more likely that we're going to be mined for bauxite than we are, contacted in the interest of global harmony, cosmic harmony, I should say. I mean, what do you think of that?
Well, I think it's possible. I think, so a few things, I guess. So, I do think if any extraterrestrials that expand and reach Earth, perhaps, like you're saying, are more likely to be the threat. And the ones that are out there that maybe don't expand at all and maybe hopefully send some radio signals, those might be the more beneficial ones. But they might never ever come here.
It's like... Go ahead. You go ahead, yeah.
Well, so sort of to go a little bit to our last question too. Part of what we're doing here, we're not saying here's what the extraterrestrials are going to be like. We don't know that, obviously. But what we're doing is once you enter a system where there's more than just life on Earth, we're now supposing that there's Earth life, including human civilization, and then some other extraterrestrial civilizations. Once we have that in our framework, then the ethics just gets a little bit interesting because there are different things that you can value that we don't necessarily always think of valuing on Earth. So on Earth, we might think we value life and human life. Most people agree we value human life. There's been human rights movement's been going on for a long time, and so you make a certain action. We say, how does that affect human rights? There's rights of life, not non-human, but just living things, and you get to interesting questions. If Mars had microbes, would you colonize it? And if Mars had squirrels, would you colonize it? What are the rights of different life forms? Certainly, if Mars had other human-like forms, probably would say no, don't colonize it.
Right.
So those are ways that we tend to value things now. But when you get into this idea that there's other civilizations out there, then there are additional things you can value. You could be a civilization that values life, and you choose to maximize life in the universe. You might choose to value intelligence and maximize intelligence, in which case the squirrel planet is okay to take over. But then there's also other things, and so this idea of valuing ecosystems or valuing diversity, there's just so many different things that could be valued by people as well as extraterrestrials. That's really where some of these scenarios come from. So again, we're not saying that extraterrestrials are going to come kill us because they see global warming in our spectral signature, but we are introducing the idea that there are a lot of different value judgments they may make, which are some value judgments that we don't think about every day now because we're just limited to Earth. So that's really the core of the point, is that there are just different values that you can have based on your framework.
Okay, a response and a follow-up to that. This might be an impossible question to answer because you have kind of, like Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration, when he opens it with "We hold these truths to be self-evident," and kind of dismisses the need to justify the list that follows. You in your paper and here say, when you're talking about this idea that an extraterrestrial ethics could value diversity for its own sake, or could value the ecosystem could be the ethical unit, the basic ethical unit.
Or utility. I mean, it doesn't have to be anything altruistic. It can be anything. They can choose to maximize utility and decide that Earth. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy values utility, and so Earth was destroyed because the space was better used for a galactic highway, I think.
Right. The Hitchhiker's Guide solution. But my question is, and like I said, you may have shielded yourself from having to answer it, and that's fair enough. There might not be a way of answering it because you say these things are intrinsically valued. I guess it's just not part of my moral imagination that I could value ecosystems intrinsically. And similarly with diversity, and diversity is one I've actually thought about because you get into arguments about political correctness and whether diversity with a capital D, as it's understood, say, on university campuses, is of any intrinsic value. I mean, I do happen to think that it's often prudent when you're making a decision about something that affects a number of categories of people to have representatives from those categories. I think there's something prudential about that. And that you'll often end up with better perspectives. But there's nothing essential or intrinsically valuable to me about diversity. And indeed, I actually will admit I just can't comprehend what could be intrinsically valuable about an ecosystem, except that it contains life that we value. So can you try and unpack that a little for me? Because that's a curious feature of the paper, the idea that aliens might value ecosystems.
Sure. And, we're, of course, not saying that this is what we all should adopt, this ecosystem-centric ethical framework, nor are we saying this is the most appealing or the one that may, we're not even saying most people have this view, although some people may. I guess, in some ways, this stems from this sustainability idea that sort of if you've and maybe this is a little bit, spiritual, and maybe the people who value ecosystems do it for spiritual reasons. But in a sense, if you've achieved this sustainable balance and you've done this consciously and it's of your own choice, then maybe it's because you have chosen to view yourself as part of the natural world instead of, a force that conquers and subdues the natural world. And, sometimes in political or religious language, we say that, humans we separate humans from nature and we make humans, the masters of the world. So in some sort of philosophical, quasi-spiritual sense, if you really achieve sustainable, development and that sort of equilibrium, maybe you realize that you're part of the ecosystem, and then maybe that in turn leads you to value ecosystems, because you're part of that. So that's sort of where the line of reasoning goes.
See, this is, I think, a fundamental tension it gets to a fundamental tension, I think, and again, I'm not labeling you as such, but so this might be a non sequitur, but this gets to me to a fundamental tension in the progressive worldview, which is that on the one hand, and there's traces of this in the paper when you talk about how it's likely that how it's unlikely that an alien civilization would use this as a source of labor or food, because by the very fact of them successfully arriving at Earth, they must have solved, and you specifically say they must have solved their food and labor problems through a combination of, I think, machine labor, conservation, and something else. So on the one hand, there's this idea that the tools of science and of human reason are going to get us to this brighter future. And on the other hand, and I think this is increasingly predominant, on the left in America and in Western Europe is the sense that human beings are fundamentally parasitic, and that the more we decenter ourselves from our own conception of the world, and the more that we, whether it's embracing ecosystems is more ethically venerable than human beings, or talking about the benefits to the planet of the next plague that might happen to befall us. Those two ideas to me seem in tension with one another.
Oh, I agree.
And it might not be the case that the average working scientist holds them, but it's certainly the case that the American left, and again, I'm a lowly political blogger, so forgive me for dragging this back to politics all the time, but it's certainly to me the case that the American left holds both of these views, or most of them do. And I wondered if you have, and it's fine if you don't, but I wondered if you have any comment about that.
Well, so just to clarify, you're saying that the American left holds both views, that number one, technology may help us overcome our obstacles, but number two, that human beings are fundamentally parasitic?
Yes, and it's more than just that technology could help us. It's that the special gifts of human reason. In other words, the idea, going back to Spencer, that man is the measure of all things, and that sort of that was really, I think, part and parcel with the Enlightenment. I mean, went hand in hand with the Enlightenment and with these massive advances in science, was this idea of conquering and subduing nature, right?
Right.
And
right.
so the contemporary worldview pits that against something with which I don't think it's consistent, which is this idea that human beings are no more valuable than anything else, and that and any other source of life, and in fact that the planet might be better off without us.
Yeah. So I'll answer that by just giving you my personal opinion, and I won't propose to speak for my co-authors or anything like that. I would say I fall somewhere in the middle of that. I do. So I like people, I'm a person. I hope people go on living for, a really long time. I really don't want to see people go extinct. I think what we need is a little more humility. I think technology is fine. I don't think we're inherently evil and we're going, our very existence on this planet is a threat. But I do think that as a species, we tend to get a little arrogant sometimes in our achievements and our intellect. And I think those are good things. I think we should use our intellect and we should develop technology. But I think we should stay a little humble while we're doing it, because that's really, to me, where we get in a lot of trouble, where we overextend ourselves, like, we know how to do this. And usually when we try to mess with really complex systems, for example, introducing a species is an example I like to use, we do it badly. So
yes.
We really don't know as much as we think we know, even though we know a lot. We can go to the moon, we can, build cities and all kinds of things. So we do know a lot, but in the grand scheme of things, we really know very little. So to my mind, technology has a big role to play in this. There are some problems with population growth seems to be stabilizing. There are some problems with consumption that hopefully we will address. But to me, I think it's through both of those. I think there is a combination, but it's really, maybe using the gifts we have, realizing that we are part of, we're not subduing the earth. We're part of the earth. We're part of this world, but we are special. We have these minds. We have brains. We have technologies that other creatures don't. So we're not no different than the rest of nature, but we are part of nature instead of separate from nature. So that's how I would say that. So to me, it's realizing our gifts, realizing that we're part of nature, and then just being a little humble as we go about our business, so we maybe don't get ourselves in so much trouble.
Okay, that's good. So last question, I think we can wrap up with this conversation, because you've been very stingy with your personal views on the political ramifications of some of the scientific evidence here, and I understand your desire to do that. But let me attempt to hoist you by your own petard here, because you've expressed what I would actually argue is a very conservative position, which is one of humility, or almost, religious people would say piety, before that which you do not understand because of its sheer size, complexity, and scope. And we're talking here about creation itself, right? So I think that's a very conservative sentiment. I also think it's the sentiment. I mean, my colleague here at National Review puts it really well when he says that a big problem with the advances in science, especially in the 20th century, and the way that they related to kind of utopian schemes in politics, is that we went from thinking of politics as the art of the possible and started thinking of it as the art of the conceivable. In other words, that anything that we could dream up in our imaginations, science would eventually deliver the goods, and we could get there. And we sort of set unrealistically high hopes for ourselves for what's possible, because science had heretofore been very successful. I mean, everything from vaccination to internal combustion, all this stuff, right? That had dramatically improved life. But what I want to say is this humility is actually the very thing that motivates, I think, the better, more careful and thoughtful climate skeptics, and it motivates them on two levels. One is that, we realize just how many variables go into the climate and in turn climate models, right? And we are convinced that climate modeling is a really, really brute, quick and dirty state right now, and we're also just very sort of suspicious about the complexity of the system and our ability to master it with current technology and methodology. And second, because I think this is actually more interesting, because I'm not a guy who I'll give away I'll give away this. I think climate change is clearly happening. I mean, and I think that all you really need to believe that is an acceptance of the properties that make carbon dioxide a greenhouse gas, right? So
Right.
once you've measured carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and once you understand its effect, its insulating effect, well, then you have to buy that climate change is happening, and that it's and so on. But where I think a lot of smart conservatives and climate skeptics depart is they say, well, look, but that's not where the argument ends. The argument about what we ought to do about it is constrained by 1,000 other things. And my colleague Jim Manzi, who's trained as an economist, but who's just a all-around brilliant guy, makes this point time and time again that we're not climate skeptics in the sense that we don't think climate change is happening. One, we don't want to be cocky about parceling out how much of it is man-made and how much of it is due to other factors. And two, even if we say, okay, let's give it the benefit of the doubt and be safe and say that we're doing it, well, then all these other things come into play. The economic impact of schemes to remediate it, the fact that you can't control what China does, the fact that it's the industrialized West that's turning to the industrializing East and saying, well, we got to pump a couple quadrillion tons of coal dust into the air, but sorry, you don't get to.
Right, exactly.
So anyway, so there's all these, and I think this is getting, another one of my long-winded questions, but this is getting back to what you said, that we ought to be humble about what's possible, and we ought to be humble about trying to re-engineer the world as it is from any sort of height or, from any sort of global position of coercion and control. So, I mean, doesn't that jive with what you avowed as your own view on these things?
No, I certainly see what you're saying, and I can see, although I probably I wouldn't align myself with those climate skeptics. Those are the
Right.
type of skeptics that I like to have dialogue with. People who are willing to address the scientific issues and perhaps aren't even critical of the science so much as the implications or the policy and economics that's required from that. But yes, I think that humility is one of their motivating factors. On my end, although I might not join their conclusions, I'm a climate modeler. I'm quite skeptical about very attempts to say we've simulated the Earth, and we might call these
Yes.
Earth system models, or there's a lot of names for these, but it's where you come up with a model and say we're representing the climate, the atmosphere, and the ocean, and we have the carbon cycle in there, and we have soil, and we have vegetation, and I see these big computers get lots of runtime and thousands of dollars goes into doing these calculations. And, I'm not going to say no useful, they get good information out of these and they're doing science. But at the same time, I'm not convinced that the best way to study the climate system is to try to create a replica of the climate system with all of its complexities. And so the models that I tend to gravitate towards tend to be very simple. Like, we're just going to model the atmosphere, just the winds, because they follow Newton's laws, and we're going to, we really tease it apart to understand basic mechanisms, which we could then compare with how the world actually works. So for me, maybe the humility enters into it more as just be aware of what the tools are and what the limitations of the tools are, and not trying to overextend this to try to do something grandiose when, in fact, maybe we can just understand a little bit of a simple piece of the puzzle right now.
We should wrap this up, and also I'm going to take us even deeper into the weeds here, but I have to ask because I'm just curious about stuff like this. Do you see it, and it connects up with the broader theme, do you see it as a problem of computational firepower, or is it something more fundamental than that you're skeptical? You said you were skeptical about our ability to model the climate. I'll tell you, I won't name the company, but I interviewed with a prominent and very well-off research firm years and years ago that were developing a supercomputer to simulate protein folding, right, so that they could model drugs.
Right.
And they when they were describing to me in broad outline, they didn't hire me, so they didn't give me the gory details, but they were describing to me in broad outline the way that the way the simulations work. They said that they were going to make this sort of leaps and bounds improvement over the way things used to be, which is that when you were modeling a protein folding, the water was kind of most happened in saline or in water or something, that it was just like a field, like a one-line algorithm, whereas this supercomputer had so much firepower that each molecule of water and its interactions with every other molecule of water were going to be individually represented, right? So I remember hearing that and thinking, we live in the future, but I wonder if you think, and Blogging Heads might end up cutting this because we have to be putting people to sleep here. But I wonder if you think that that's, if, like I said, is it a computational firepower problem, or is it just we don't have enough ones and zeros to model the climate, or do you think it's actually that it's a cognitive problem?
No, I do not think it's not a computer problem. You could build as big of a computer as you want, but I don't think the world is not deterministic. At least if quantum mechanics has any sort of bearing on what we understand the world to be like, there is uncertainty when you get down to the atomic and subatomic level. And when you have that kind of uncertainty, then it's pretty much impossible to measure to model that with a computer. And that's only, that's in the extreme example like you're discussing, where they actually are modeling each molecule. Stepping back to climate, they're not even getting anywhere near that close. Right. But, so something simple is like, let's say you've got climate, you've atmosphere, ocean, carbon cycle, soil, and vegetation process. Do you need to include convection of the Earth's mantle in this? Because it's certainly going to affect things. The Earth is just such a complex system. And it's not even a closed system. There are, it interacts with space and the sun and meteorites
solar
and things
flares,
that enter it, solar flares. So it's such a complex system. To me, it's almost futile to try to represent every part of that system with a computer. And it's more useful to maybe understand individual components of that system to get a little bit of a broader understanding. But no, I don't think it's a computational problem at all.
Okay. Well, Jacob, I think this was a fascinating and fruitful conversation, and I thank you for having it with me.
Oh, you're quite welcome. I had a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. Bye.
Bye.